Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday the 7th of July. My name is Brian Liddy and I'm joined today by two guests. We've got Sandra White, ex-SNP MSP, now retired. Sandra is a great supporter of social justice and was convener of a cross-party group of on Palestine in Holyrood. Forgive me, Sandra, stumbling over my words there. Welcome.
Thank you, Brian. Good morning.
Thanks for giving up part of your weekend. And Pat Kane, Pat, you're well known as one half of the 80s pop duo, Hue and Cry. And your website says you're a writer, curator, consultant, activist, and futurist. You're also a political columnist, and I'd say you're a deep thinker. And you're currently working on a new book on politics and the science of emotions. So again, thank you. Welcome to Broadcasting Scotland.
I'm sorry, I'm so busy I have to leave.
Okay, well, we'll see you later. Well, maybe see you next week
I'll
then.
see you next week. Bye.
Okay, no, really seriously, Pat, thank you for giving up a good
You're,
chunk of your weekend for us, your Sunday
you're most
afternoon.
you're most
Um,
welcome.
so we'll start with our sadly routine Ukraine update. Today is day 865 of the Ukraine war. Russian shelling killed 3 civilians in Ukraine's southern region of Kherson on Saturday, officials said. 2 bodies were recovered from the rubble of a house that came under fire in the morning in a village near Berislav, north of Kherson town, prosecutors said. An artillery strike in the evening killed 1 person in a village south of the town, said the region's governor, Alexander Produkin. Russian nighttime strikes left more than 100,000 homes without power in northern Ukraine and cut off the water supply to a regional capital, Ukrainian authorities said on Saturday. The northern Sumy region, which borders Russia, was plunged into darkness after Russian strikes late on Friday damaged energy infrastructure, and Ukrainian energy minister said. Fire broke out at a gas pipeline in Crimea, Russian-installed officials said on Sunday, blaming an accident and stating there were no casualties. Videos online showed a large fire said to have followed 1 or more explosions in the Alushta district. Russian air defense units downed 7 Ukrainian drones, each in the southern Belgorod and Kursk region on the Ukrainian border on Saturday, officials and the military said. Russia's defense ministry said 7 drones were intercepted over the Belgorod region, which is subjected to nearly daily Ukrainian attacks. Alexei Smirnov, the governor of Kursk region, farther north and west, also reported 7 drones had been downed over his region. Ukrainian forces had shelled about 10 villages across the day. Mykola Oleshchuk, Ukraine's Air Force commander, said his forces had duped Russian troops into deploying missiles against sophisticated models put in place to look like military targets. Models depicting fighter aircraft and a surface-to-air missile battery were put in place at an airfield near the central city of Kryvyi and a district of the Black Sea port of Odessa. A video described as footage from a Russian reconnaissance drone showed what Oleshchuk said were Russian Iskander missiles attacking the depictions. Air Force personnel conducted passive defence measures, he wrote. In Ukraine's eastern frontline region of Donetsk, Russian shelling killed 11 civilians and wounded 43 on Friday and overnight to Saturday, according to the regional governor. 5 people died in the town of Seldov, southeast of Pokrovsk, the eastern city that has emerged as a frontline hotspot. On Saturday, the Ukrainian General Staff said that Ukrainian and Russian forces clashed 45 times near Pokrovsk over the previous day. The Russian Ministry of Defence has claimed its troops have captured a village about 30 kilometres east of the city. An oil truck collided with a minibus in western Ukraine on Saturday, killing 14 people, including a 6-year-old child, and leaving a single survivor, emergency services said. Japan has announced a joint project with Cambodia to share knowledge and technology on landmine removal with countries worldwide, including Ukraine. Under the Japan-Cambodia Landmine Initiative, Japan will provide full-scale assistance to humanitarian mine action in Ukraine, Japan's Foreign Minister Yoko Kamikawa said in Phnom Penh. Sandra, I've asked you this question many times before. Is there anything in today's Ukraine update that you'd like to highlight?
Well, there is one thing I think we should be very aware of, obviously, the elections in France. Le Pen has said that she's looking to reduce support for Ukraine. For instance, not supplying them with French weapons, and obviously Macron's issue with the fact that he was wanting to put boots on the ground, troops on the ground. She says she will absolutely not do that. So that's a worrying aspect, of obviously the right wing will go into that as well. But that's a very worrying aspect of the fact that if they do win, a majority in the French elections, there'll be less support for Ukraine. But I do reiterate what I've been saying from the very, very beginning. Billions of pounds have been spent on weapons and support for Ukraine. And yet the people there are still suffering. They're still dying, as you've said, about explosions, etc. as well. And when you look at NATO, who I've never have been a supporter of NATO, I think we need to look at that again. We need to look at diplomatic channels to try and resolve this. But it's went on for so long. They missed a chance in 2014 with Crimea. They let it simmer away, and this is the result of it. So I would like somebody really, if there is anybody in that position, to start questioning, one, the billions that's went into Ukraine. Is it being beneficial for the Ukrainian people? I don't think so. Where the monies went, basically, and also the fact, what really is Europe and NATO's role in the situation in Ukraine? People can't keep dying all the time, and this is what's happening there, and I really don't see an end to it. I mean, you look at the economy, the one economy that's growing is actually Russia's economy, even with all the sanctions. So there's a lot of questions to be asked. I really can't see an end to this war at all.
Thanks, Sandra. You mentioned possible French support being reduced, and of course, with the US elections coming up, if Trump wins, then that's going to be another blow into Ukraine. Pat, what about you? Was there anything that you'd like to say?
Well, I was just doing a bit of preparatory reading before this show, and I read a few things I thought were interesting. I mean, there's a survey of European leaders conducted by Mark Leonard's European think tank, which very solid majorities for a negotiated settlement to be the outcome of this, rather than victory for one side or the other. I mean, I also noted that on the horizon is a possible Trump victory, which would almost certainly begin a certain attitude towards America's involvement in that theatre of war. I'm a kind of congenital peacenik, and what that implies is I'm always looking for the peaceful outcome as opposed to a long grinding conflict. So, and that means having to talk about diplomacy and geopolitics in quite a long framework. I mean, Sandra's kind of mentioning it, but that there can't be immediate NATO accession for Ukraine, because part of the problem of this is that NATO incursion into Ukraine, betrayed the idea that there was going to be buffer zones between Russia and the countries of the former Soviet Union. So that was something I picked up, that there's a nervousness amongst many of the commentaria about NATO membership for Ukraine, because then that triggers all manner of solidaristic responses. An injury to one is an injury to all, and I think negotiation with the end point of reducing the destruction of everyday life in Ukraine, and also I think there's one of the things that we're going to talk about, Israel Gaza in a minute. I think it's always important to have one eye and one ear out for what's happening in the domestic realm. I mean, it's a terrible situation in Russian civil society. There's no space for protest. It's a thoroughly surveyed and cowed society. That's not quite the case in Israel, which we can come to talk about. You can hear quite a lot of dissent against the state actions from within the country. But I've always want to sort of, try to kind of figure out how the civilian population of a warring country can itself contribute to peace. So I mean, I don't see anything from your report, which is a kind of almost reminds me of the kind of newsreel from the Second World War, battles and maneuvers and takings and relinquishings and surrenders. Um, I think we're in a situation where there's a vast drumbeat driving us towards war, never mind the whole pivot to China and Taiwan and so forth. And I always have to ask in a classic lefty manner, in whose interests are these calls and drumbeats being performed? The military-industrial complex is always a player in this, no matter what the situation is. So I'm not as despairing as Sandra, because I think the attrition is so high that a negotiated settlement is coming. But if that negotiated settlement comes, let's remember what one element of the conditions were that triggered it in the first place, which is, a certain element of NATO expansionism. I have no brief for the Putin regime, not a scintilla, but we have to be wise about this situation rather than tribal.
Thanks, Pat. It's interesting you mentioned sort of a Second World War feel to it. When there was something in the Ukraine update where it talked about fake model airplanes acting as
Yeah.
decoys. I mean, that was a Second World War thing, wasn't it? But time's against us, so we'd better move on to the update in Gaza. So at least 38,098 Palestinians have been killed and 87,705 people have been injured in Gaza since the 7th of October. As another Israeli strike on a school where, forgive me, I'll start that again. As another Israeli strike on a school where displaced people were sheltering killed 16 people yesterday. Our question to you, Pat, I'll come to you first, is will the new Labour government now push for an immediate ceasefire? Just before you come in there, Pat, I think it's fair to say that Gaza hardly featured in the campaign. Very, very few people mentioned, Gaza or Ukraine. And so, yes, well, what do you think is the new Labour government going to be able to do for Gaza?
Well, except by implication, which is that was the basis for the majorities of many of the independents, including Jeremy Corbyn, and not just him, that happened in a sporadic way up and down the country with strong Muslim populations. So it sort of turned out to be an issue by people, some people voting with their feet. Yes, I think there has to be. I would hope that the Labour Party lines up behind an immediate ceasefire. I go to very maybe odd places for my information on this, and one of the places that I regularly go is the opinion editorial page of an Israeli liberal left newspaper called Haaretz, and it's an indication that we can separate, Israeli civil society, which is full of countercurrents and flows, from the actions of the Israeli Defense Force or the Israeli state, the Israeli politicians. The contempt for Netanyahu amongst, that I read every day in Haaretz, amongst the intelligentsia is overpowering. I mean, it's regularly stated in Haaretz that the reason for the war continuing is so that his particular constitutional crimes, his particular political crimes, cannot be investigated. So we're in this very meretricious, cheap situation where a politician is conducting war so that there is no jaw about his legitimacy as a political leader. So by comparison with Ukraine and Russia, I think there are forces within Israeli society that are about to amass. There's Haaretz reports are not quite a lot of demonstrations happening, weekly demonstrations happening against the existing government. So there is fluidity there. There is political fluidity within Israel, which would be the best way for them, would be the best process whereby this terrible, terrible, and totally disproportionate action upon the Palestinian people for the massacre on October the 7th can be mitigated. If the pressure comes from Israeli society and Israeli opinion leaders and cultural leaders in general, I think that's a good sign.
Thank you, Pat. It's good to hear about alternative news sources. Always.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. Sandra, times is against us, but have you got anything that you'd like to say about Gaza? I should have maybe come to you first, considering you were a convener of the cross-party group on Palestine. Forgive me.
No, not at all, Brian. I mean, I think, Pat has hit it on the head there. Basically, I think there's certain sections of the Israeli society, people, who are moving against Netanyahu and against the Zionist government. And I would probably use the word, maybe not as strongly, but it certainly seems as though there's certain sections of Israel it's imploding. I think that's the word I would use. It is imploding. And that is the fact of, there's people within society in Israel going out there and demonstrating, but it's also the fact of the demonstrations that are taking part across the world. It's devastating to see. We all know that. We're watching it on the TV all the time when we can get information out. And that was one of the ones I wanted to actually press on, and basically Pat has introduced it a wee bit. Yeah, there's some publications which are great, but for a country not to allow foreign journalists in to report, this is a big problem. We're getting some news, thank goodness, from very, very brave people, but it can't go on. It can't go on. And basically, will Labour push for an immediate ceasefire? No, I don't think they will. I mean, it's been all over the press saying that, we're going to immediate ceasefire, release the hostages, aid, etc., etc. But that's just talk. This will continue on, supposedly to have diplomatic talks. Well, the time for talking's done. Thousands of people are being killed, and we know it's a genocide, and we know that the Zionists are behind it. Everybody knows. Even the Jewish people who are in Israel know about it. Even they are being arrested and put into jail for being against Netanyahu. But we cannot let this continue. This is an absolute genocide in this century, and here we are, televised, and it's still going on. When are they going to or they should have put a peacekeeping troops in there, and then we come back to NATO again. They do it in other countries, they can't do that there. I just find it appalling that the West sits back and says a lot of good words, but lets it continue, and I have no faith in Labour coming in immediately. They'll talk about it, because they did get a fright, as Pat had said. It certainly, the Gaza situation certainly raised its head down there. It raised its head here as well. I had people come and speak to me about it on the doorsteps too. So it's there at the forefront, and they need to do something before there's practically nothing left of Gaza, and whole legions of intellectuals, universities, doctors, nurses. They're targeting the culture and everything else of the Palestinian people to eradicate the Palestinians. And I can't say any stronger words than that. Basically, they're just so bad, and it has to stop.
Yeah, thanks, Sandra. Time will tell, I suppose, maybe sooner rather than later. But I keep hearing that Starmer's going to have his honeymoon is going to be short. So maybe Gaza and Ukraine will be part of that. So we're moving on to the general election. I'll just do a really quick run through of the final results. There were 650 seats up for grabs. Labour managed to secure 411 of them. That's up 211. Tony Blair, they just fell short of Tony Blair's record-breaking 418 seats. The Conservatives lost 249 seats, dropping to 121. That's a collapse, but not a total wipeout that many people predicted. The Lib Dems did really well. They got 71 seats. That's up 63. The SNP were scalped and went from 38 down to 9. In Scotland, 36% of the vote went to Labour and got them 37 seats in Scotland. Meanwhile, the SNP got 30% of the vote, but they only got 9 seats. And so that's the first past the post system is to blame there. Greens got 4 votes, and all in England, and Reform secured 5 seats. Plaid Cymru went up to 4. The Greens also increased to 4, and there were 6 independents. That includes the Speaker. It's one of the biggest landslides ever, one of the lowest turnouts ever. The Greens did well to quadruple their seats. It was a strong result for Reform. They got 50% more votes than the Lib Dems, but they got less seats again because their vote was spread so thinly, and that the first past the post system punishes them for that. But my question to you, Sandra, is so Labour won in England on policies, but because of Labour won in England not on policies, but because of the collapse of the Tories. But why did the SNP lose so badly in Scotland when Plaid Cymru managed to double their number of MPs in Wales?
There's lots of questions to be asked about that. Basically, and also in your introduction, in regards to the first past the post situation, 30% of the vote, you get 9 MPs, first past the post. Labour, 36% of the vote, and they get that amount as well. I think it was Labour won because of the collapse of the Tories, an anti-Tory vote. And basically, we pushed that here in Scotland as well. We says make Scotland Tory free, vote the SNP. So we were pushing that too. So I think that was a mistake, basically. And let's not forget, in 2015 we had 56 MPs, and a lot of that has been simmering the fact that we had 56 MPs and we did nothing with it, nothing at all. Biggest majority we've ever had at Westminster, and we did nothing with it. And that resentment has been simmering and simmering, and obviously you've got the Alba Party and various others who sprung up in that respect. We did not, and the backlash of obviously the media, which did not help at all, and then obviously the unfortunate incidents we had to get ourselves through, so it wasn't an awful lot going for us. But my big problem is the fact that every time there's an election, we come out with independence is the way. We should have had independence at the forefront of every campaign, everything that went out to the media, away back from 1999, even before that, because then it would become a household name. Everybody, you would talk about independence as if you were talking about, a loaf of bread or something. It would be in the psyche. We've never done that, and I always thought that was a terrible mistake. But we have to obviously regroup, and also, as I said previous to that as well, the first past the post system, perhaps we should be saying to Stammer, today John Swinney's meeting him, isn't he? Say to him, well, one of the things we think you should do is proportional representation, for Westminster. But then again, our job is independence. The SNP's job is independence, and the yes vote is still strong. The support for independence is strong. There's a lot of questions that need to be asked about the structure, basically the makeup of who's all working in HQ, where was the rebuttal unit. There's lots of questions to be asked, and I thought John Swinney did a good job. He did try and marry the independence into everyday life, but it was too late. It should have been done ages ago. So I'm afraid there's got to be a lot of navel gazing in the SNP, in the hierarchy, and also the people who are in the NEC and various other things as well. They need to listen to the grassroots, because the grassroots had their finger right there on the ground. They knew what was happening. They knew what people wanted. And to continue telling people that Westminster, vote for Westminster, when you can't possibly get a majority. These are one of the things that we should be talking about forever. Westminster's alien to Scotland, the same as it's alien to Wales, and good on Wales for getting these extra MPs. But then they didn't have as much backlash from the media, and I say that in a way, you can't keep blaming people all the time. I mean, I do blame the media for a lot of stuff, but I think it's time we actually looked at ourselves and decided what's been happening is not good enough for the people who still support independence. I've still got hope. We need to give the hope to the people, and it's just not worked. It's worked very well for a lot of stuff under devolution, but we can't keep talking about devolution all the time. Independence is the goal, always should have been, and we took our eye off the ball. Rant over.
No, not at all. Thank you, Sandra. You prompted me.
It's a good rant.
Yeah, absolutely. You prompted a couple of things that I should mention. So Wales is now completely Tory-free zone when it comes to Tory MPs. And Alba, we should maybe mention they lost all of their deposits. But Pat, I seem to remember when the general election campaign started, both Starmer and Swinney sounded the same. Both Labour and SNP were saying the answer is growth and economic growth, and we can't do anything without economic growth. And then later on, Swinney then started to say we can't do that without independence. So same question to you, really. Why did the SNP do so badly?
Well, I think recent shenanigans won't have helped. I think the Central Belt, it's interesting when you look at the map of votes where they're distributed. The Central Belt is like this kind of gigantic red organ, or as it was, yellow organ right across the middle of the country. You clearly displease it at your peril. The other thing just to note is if you add up all the votes of the independent supporting parties, that's the majority of votes over unionist votes, even yet, as we are, even with the recent results. So certainly the idea that there's any kind of demise going on about the independence movement, whether it's in the streets or at the party level, is obviously ridiculous. I take, as may be obvious in this contribution to your programme, I take kind of slightly odd angles on things to hopefully to illuminate myself. And I was writing about my column on Saturday in the National, covering a guy called James Meadway, who was a Corbyn economic advisor, actually quite a friendly voice towards Scottish independence, towards 2013, 2014. And he would say, stability and growth were the kind of concepts that the Starmer and Swinney would share. But his perspective, but Meadway's perspective on the Starmer project's prospects is pretty grim. He thinks they're going to be quite easily knocked off course by rising costs of living and economic shocks as a result of environmental degradation. I mean, I'm quite green in that respect. I think there's a lot of trouble and a lot of challenge coming to governances and parliaments from baked-in climate change. And so the question is whether his question for the Starmer project is, do they have enough policy tools in their toolbox? Or are they going to allow themselves to reach for them in a ways that's going to help them have to respond to economic shocks coming from climate change? And in terms of why independence, well, independence really addresses a lot of those things directly. Reform was at 7% in Scotland rather than 14% in the rest of the country. So we're not susceptible, it's not zero, to right-wing appeals. What's independence for? Well, it shows that allows us to show that we're a different society, we have a different set of priorities. In terms of there being an economic shock on supply chains of fuel or food, which is predicted. Again, why do you want independence? Because we should be encouraging self-reliance and self-provision in these matters of energy and food. And we know how rich a country we are. It's a scandal that there's fuel poverty in a fuel-rich country, but we need to actually think about independence in the context of providing a buffer to these shocks. We need to sort of turn towards each other in Scotland and say, well, what are the structures that we need to ride out the next 20, 30 years? I mean, and also I would say, and it's not a romantic point, but I think the anti-nuclear and peace-oriented perspective of an independent Scotland stands us in good stead in the face of the absurdity of showing how nuclear weapons are a permanent explosive possibility. I mean, you just need to look at Russian posturing in Ukraine over that. But it also gives a message to the world that we are a peaceful nation rather than a warring nation. And I think that message is a message that you can bear on the wings of independence. But it's not just, as I say, some romantic, idealistic message. I see that the Starmer government are trying to sort of say, well, we're going to be a haven for investment because look around you, look at what's happening in Europe, look at what's happening in America. This is the place where you want to come and bring your capital. Let's see if they benefit from that. I think independence rises up when the British state looks like it cannot deliver. This is a moment in the central belt of Scotland where it looked like the British state could deliver. But the independence is still at 50%, without much of a campaign on it, as Sheila has said. But I think the utility of Scottish independence, we need to keep thinking about that. We need to keep thinking about what are the conjunctures, the shocks, the challenges, the opportunities that come along to say you should be in charge of all your resources in your own territory, because it's going to be a challenging century. And I think that argument will come around again. Is Solid John the guy to convey that? Actually, I thought a Humza and a Green party in the Parliament together was one way to begin to prepare us for the future. That still effectively is the case for the next 2 years, but I think we need some fundamental rethinking of why people emotionally would want to feel and be independent, and that's not just at the nation state level, but at the individual and community level as well. I think there's a lot of work to be done about shifting the ground in Scotland towards self-determination at lower levels, subsidiarity, the Europeans used to call it, rather than always thinking about the macro level. That's the only target for independence.
Thank you, Pat. I did read your piece in the National. I would thoroughly recommend it to anybody. It's very interesting. And after your observations about the map in Scotland from the general election, I'm going to have to go back and take a look at that organ or member, was it you described it as, across the central belt?
A limb, a tentacle.
A limb. Anyways, yes. So as I keep saying, time is very much against us. So I'll move on. So in the decades since Thatcher, British politics seem to have moved to the right. Certainly when you look at Keir Starmer, he says that there's a lot of things about the Tory policies, fiscal policies, that he will not change. So Labour policies in 2024 are hard to distinguish from Tory policies of the 1990s. What has driven this move to the right, and what role does the media play in this? Pat, I think it's your turn to go first this time.
Okay.
Media, what do you think?
Well, the media is a problem, and again, the Corbynites were quite interesting because they wanted to address the question of right-wing commercial monopolisation of the national press and the national media, and that's probably one of the reasons why they had to be stopped one way or the other. I did know. I mean, it is the story of the election that that Reform won it for the Labour Party. I mean, they split Tory vote after Tory majority after Tory majority. I think it's interesting to keep an eye on the kind of behaviour that's going to come from the Reform Party in Westminster and how that's going to click into their press coverage. Some of the commentators I've been reading say we must try and get Reform right. It's not just an anti-immigration party. I think they're going to get involved in a whole range of culture wars around sexuality and gender and race and civilization, and defend the West against the rest and all the rest of it. I think they're going to have quite a broad front of things that they cause trouble over, consonant with funding organisations that are doing an effect, achieving the same effect in various nation states in Europe. So European politics has come, in its worst sense, has come to the Westminster Parliament through the vehicle of Reform. So it's just, we shouldn't underestimate them. And also in terms of 2026, we should be ready for proportionality under the AMS system in Scotland to deliver Reform seats in the Scottish Parliament. I'd like to figure out maybe how we can make sure that doesn't happen, but proportionality means that if there are people who want to join in with that particular culture war in Scotland, they're going to be less, but they might just get over the wire in terms of representation in the Scottish Parliament, in the way that UKIP got over the wire for European representation a couple of years ago in Scotland. So I think one of the things about, and again, an argument for independence is that if Reform make a lot of hay pointing out the Starmer Labs failures and inability to act on certain issues over the next couple of years, and then the gulf between Scotland and the rest of the UK begins to widen ideologically again. That's obviously a situation in which independence arises as a way to defend the democratic qualities and exact nature of Scottish life that isn't like this. But I think we need to be aware that people out of insecurity, fear, and worry will point towards the worst angels of their nature. That can happen. We want it to happen less in Scotland. I don't think we'll be able to fully eradicate it. But I think one of the things that people should feel in a Scotland still getting ready for independence is that they have power over their lives rather than no power over their lives. Empowerment is psychologically important in defeating neo-fascism and neo-reaction. And we need to start to devote an awful lot of policy and interest in Scotland towards everyday empowerment of people as much as we can within the devolved powers. And that means looking at things like reviving council tax, reviving local democracy, innovating with democracy, which was supposedly what the Scottish Parliament was about in the first place. We need to do that for quite acute anti-fascist reasons.
Thank you, Pat. You mentioned reform, and so I'll move on to the next question for you, Sandra. Is so Reform, they got 5 seats in the Westminster general election, and there's going to be a vote today in France, the second part of their election. Is the prominence of Farage and the Reform comparable to the rise of the right in Europe?
I think so. I think we need to cast our minds back a wee bit and realise that Reform has came out of Brexit, really. The Tory party then, Farage right-wing party, Tory parties tried to go as more right-wing than them. Labour joined the club to try and be more right-wing than them. And then obviously Farage getting all of the coverage he did in the newspapers. I was really quite disgusted that they didn't stand up for their ideals, the Labour Party, instead of trying to go as right-wing as well, immigration mugs and jobs for British people, all that stuff. They actually helped to create this myth that people who come here from other countries, it's bad, they steal your jobs. Pat had already alluded to that type of rhetoric, basically. So I think the media's got to have a good look at itself, and by the media, I mean the printed media, but also in particular the BBC as well, because they've had Farage on, even now with the Reform, same number of seats as the Greens have got, and yet they weren't even included in any of the debates or anything like that. And then you mentioned Europe there, Brian, as well. Now you've got a very difficult situation there, basically for any left-wing or socially leaning parties, because you've got Orban in Hungary, who wants to look at, and I think the name of it is Parties for Europe. He wants to look at creating right-wing parties for Europe, and he's already getting support from a number of countries. Finland is one which I never thought he would see. So definitely the right-wing is on the rise, and it's usually the reason it's on the rise, simply the same as Hitler was on the rise as well, is that you actually blame other people for problems that you may be experiencing, but it's actually the government that's making these problems, not the people who are coming in. They're not stealing jobs or anything like that. So yeah, I think it's something that we really need to keep our eye on and make sure that we don't fall down that rabbit hole of basically Reform and their policies. And I just worry that Labour, who are now in government now, I hope that they step back from that and bring forward true policies of a so-called socialist party, because they and the Tories have helped to create Reform, and Farage is not going to stop. He will meddle in everything. So there is definitely a rise in the far right, and it'll be interesting to see how it pans out in France, and if Orban actually does create this Parties for Europe, which will be a movement of right-wing governments throughout Europe. It's worrying.
Thank you, Sandra. You mentioned the BBC there in relation to Farage, and they maybe helped create him. I don't know if you saw the recent BBC question times with Fiona Bruce when Farage was on in the run-up as part of the campaign and the debates. And she challenged him directly about blatant racism in his party. And I wish we had more time to talk about that, but I thought that was interesting.
Hmm.
Time really is against us. We're behind, so I'm going to move on. So Keir Starmer's on his way to Scotland today to meet the First Minister. He says that Starmer says he's going to reset relations with the devolved governments. Um, but we're wondering what policy changes can we expect and what impact will they have in Scotland if Labour are going to stick to Tory spending plans as they said they would during the campaign. And I'm just wondering, do you think will the First Minister bring up the subject of an independence referendum when he meets today? Sandra, as with your experience in Holyrood, if you were one of if you were still one of John Swinney's direct colleagues, would you be urging him to what he should bring up when he meets Starmer today?
Well, I suppose it'll be up to John what he brings up. I would assume he would mention a referendum, but I don't have great hopes of them saying yes, yes, we'll give you it, because they won't give it. It would just be part and parcel of negotiation. You would have a number of questions to ask, and basically saying, can we have a Section 30 or whatever it may be. Um, I would imagine we'd bring that up, but I don't think it will get much traction in that respect. The one thing that does worry me, and I hate to be somebody that's on the negative side all the time, I don't think Labour will give any good policies towards Scotland. But the one thing which really, really worries me is the NHS. If Labour go ahead the way West Steering had said, looking to sort of talk with the private sector for the NHS, is that a way into privatisation? Obviously, health is devolved, but we get consequentials from England. The amount of money they spend in a health service, i.e. the Barnett formula, we get consequentials. Now, that's my big worry, and I would hope he would raise that type of thing up. We know he's not going to go for the two-child when we already put that forward anyway, but my biggest worry is the NHS. If they go private, even partly private, whether we do it, well, we won't do it here in Scotland via the Scottish Government, but we will suffer from that. And I think it's something that we really should be keeping an eye on.
Thank you, Sandra. Um, I did hear some reports of that Labour might offer a tailored migration policy for Scotland.
Mm.
But I've also been hearing that a lot of people think that Ian Murray, as the Scotland Secretary, is just going to carry on the same policies as Alistair Jack did previously. Pat, what do you think? Is there going to be anything that Labour can do for Scotland? What would you expect, or what would you ask for if you had John Swinney's ear?
Well, I've been talking to Stephen Noon, the kind of the Yes Scotland and long time SNP strategist, and he idealistically says there's opportunities for the Scottish Government with the Labour government in terms of this empowerment agenda that I'm talking about. I mean, it's almost as if the Scottish Government should regard a centrist, at least not a centre right, but of course that's arguable, but say at least call them a centrist, left in left clothing, like socialist clothing government, and raise the stakes. Say, well, if this is your position, then we want to go here. Will you stop us? I mean, the classic irony of this is that he'll be up here today proclaiming that he's setting up a national energy company, UK energy based headquartered in Scotland. I mean, I'm part of the think tank group Commonweal, who has been arguing for exactly that kind of a national energy company to be set up in Scotland for about 10 years. And there they are. There's Ed Miliband stealing that policy, in my opinion, straight out of the independence kit bag. But that's maybe an indication that we should be thinking, well, if this can we hold this government to its rhetorical claims that it's about empowerment and devolving power and resources down to the lowest possible level? Can we start to kind of address questions like reform of council tax? Can we start to talk about regular citizens' incomes or different levels of deliberation that can happen in Scottish society? Can we actually get back to kind of democratic reform? With challenging Starmer's legislative power and saying, "Can you follow us? We want to go in this direction. Can we go? Would you support it?" So again, rather than it's a slightly different perspective on the classic SNP perspective of winning over by governing through competence. There's nothing wrong with governing through competence, but as Sandra said away at the beginning, there's a lack of discussion and visionary discussion about the kinds of new and better things that could be built under the powers and conditions and resources of independence. And I think we should maybe set a few flags far ahead in the future of policy and of institutions that we think we should build, and then challenge the Labour government to say, well, why not? What's stopping you? There's a recognition in Starmer's visit the day after that a lot of good ideas come from small parliaments that split the American. Supreme Court judge used to say about the states in the United States that they were laboratories of democracy. So let's be a laboratory of democracy under these circumstances, and all the strengthening that Scotland's people can get out of this situation. Let's try and get it, and let's wait for the conjuncture when the macro conditions of surrounding the Starmer government provide opportunities for the independence argument. But in the meantime, let's just see if we can push forward an empowerment agenda with them, see what happens.
Thanks, Pat. Sandra, I've been hearing a lot of people saying that they should be cautious when it comes to Starmer and Anas Sarwar's Scottish Labour Party and Scotland and what they can do for Scotland. But do you think this is at least a good sign, the fact that if you compare and contrast Starmer's visit today, I'm sure it's not going to be anything like the time when Boris Johnson came to visit Nicola Sturgeon in Bute House and there was people in the streets booing and he had to leave by the back door. So do you think that this at least shows that there is some potential, that there might be a working relationship between Holyrood and Westminster?
You would obviously hope so, and what Pat says and has raised, it's grown-up politics, isn't it? It's not just politics about throwing things at each other, and yeah, I would hope it would be that type, of liaison, and you could work together. But you see, Anas Sarwar saying that he is going to be the next First Minister. Now, having been in the Parliament, I can assure you, at this moment in time anyway, the atmosphere is absolutely toxic. You'll have seen it on the TV with First Minister questions. At least we'll get rid of Douglas Ross because he was the most toxic of them all. But I think you need to look at when the Holyrood comes back. Let's see how it plays out there, because I think the Labour Party, they will say lots of things, and I would generally hope we would enter into some form of grown-up politics and push the boundaries a wee bit via the Scottish Parliament. But independence still got to be at the very, very top. But I think we need to wait and see exactly how it pans out in Holyrood. And I've got a funny feeling that being toxic at the moment won't change when we come back after the recess. So I would keep an eye on Holyrood. That would be my thoughts. Then you'll see exactly the way it's playing out, because the Labour Party do not want to give the SNP any more power in Holyrood. So I would think a negative again. I hope not, but I don't think it will play out well when they come back. I think you need to look at that and see exactly how Anas Sarwar goes on, Jackie Baillie, etc., etc. You've had a wee snippet of it, but I can assure you, I had years of it, and it's getting more and more toxic as the time goes on.
Thanks, Sandra.
I need to pass a fruit mocktail through to you, Sandra, to cheer you up. You ready? I'm just passing it under the thing.
Thank you.
Hey, it'll pop up in 5 minutes. Get it down, you.
And what about
You
me?
put some alcohol in it, that'd be even better.
No, that's not what we're talking about.
I thought you said a mocktail.
There you go. We'll make sure that the screen's all on Pat so that you can enjoy that mocktail, Sandra, without us having to watch. Sandra, you mentioned Holyrood. The next big date in Holyrood is going to be the Holyrood elections in 2026. There's a lot of talk about ex-SNP MPs that lost their seats in the general election might be making themselves available for Holyrood in 2026. So in the next 2 years, Scotland has to decide if it wants to make its own decisions or whether it's going to fall into line with decisions made in London. What does the SNP have to do to get its act together? And what is the significance of the idea of a wider yes movement without a dominant and successful SNP? Pat, I think it is, again, it's your turn to go first. Holiday 2026 in the SNP.
Sure. I think there's some serious decisions to be made about things to do and things not to do. You know, for example, on the lines that I was talking about before, do we have a constitutional convention that states quite clearly where we need what we need next as an effective national parliament in Scotland? What powers, what stance towards it? I mean, look, so the last one established the kind of settled will of the Scottish people. Is this one to be like a kind of an idealistic statement from the heart of Scottish society about the kind of Scotland that we want to live in? Now, that has to run not just as an SNP exercise. And I think the Gordon McIntyre's camp of Believe in Scotland is trying to get people to kind of coagulate around a big idealistic statement about where Scotland should step next. Again, being part of Commonweal, that they've always been trying to kind of come up with good ideas that many people could get on board with, you know, across either the progressive or the independence spectrum of things. My suggestion would be that the SNP leadership tries to tap into that idealistic agenda. I mean, there should be a sort of magnanimity about the fact that Labour is in power at the UK level, and I wonder whether there's just a kind of rather than a carping, negative, complaining perspective, that they should be involved in big plans that call the bluff of a supposedly progressive Labour government. I would prefer that things go that way. I mean, one of the things I've realised about the early Scottish Parliament, I was actually quoting the idea of the social wage, which is a way of sort of describing the range of benefits that the SNP were campaigning on in the last election. That's quite a visionary concept, and I think we've had a lack of those big ideas. Actually, that independence is a way to deal with the future and get to grips with the future, as much as it is a restoration of what comes from the past. So I'd like a wee bit of policy ambition and idealism coming from the SNP, rather than another 2 years of demonstrating by competent management under a devolved settlement, which doesn't give you the resources to effectively manage anything much more than amelioration of what comes from Westminster. Can we take the policy optimism of this moment and build on it in Scotland? I would like the SNP to be like that, but let's see.
Yeah, a constitutional convention sounds like a good idea to me, Pat, about what kind of holiday we want to see. Sandra, if you had John Swinney's ear, if he was asking you your advice about what he should do in the next 2 years, what would you say?
I think they've got to go to the grassroots more. Basically, that I absolutely agree with Pat on that particular one. You look at the Yes movement in 2014; it was absolutely wonderful, fantastic. We need to recapture that movement. We need to recapture it. And I don't mean capture it and keep it, i.e. the SNP. We need to recapture just how buoyant it was and how, it was joyful and it was positive. So we need to recapture that. Now, how do we recapture that? Constitutional Convention, well, we did have that previously, so you're going to have some people, well, there'll be a lot of people saying, well, we've already went through all that, we're going back 10 years again, basically. But I mean, I look at Ireland where, we had the citizens, convention, and it's still there sitting in the statute book somewhere, which we haven't really used. But I mean, Ireland, they used it greatly, particularly for the Abortion Act and that type of thing. Why can't we look at that as well? Citizen convention, put forward ideas, talk to the people, let them know exactly what we want. I mean, I don't want to go back to the constant, basically negative policy of constantly saying, well, Westminster does this to us and this is what we get from it, etc., etc. I think people are becoming deaf to that. They want something, a positive message, what Scotland can do. But we also, along with that, we have to marry in Scotland can do this if we're independent. We can't do it if we're, under a devolved government. And gradualism obviously came into the SNP a good few number of years ago. Gradualism is just not, does not cut it. And with John mentioned the fact independence, and this is how we can do things for Scotland if we're independent. At the last election there, that was a kind of start to move it up a bit. I'd like to see more of that, but I also think we need to look at the structure of the SNP themselves. We need to look at exactly who's in charge. Do we need to get rid of some old wood? And I don't want to see anybody lose a job or whatever it may be. But we really need to look at that. We need to look at the structure of it. We need to get people in there who talk from the voice of the people, what they want to do. So whether it's a constitutional convention or another form that we get into the grassroots, it's got to be something like that. But, we can't continue this way. We've got to set out our policies. We've got to say, right, because as far as I'm concerned, 2026 is the last gasp chance. If we don't do well, then independence will be way, way back. And that's really sad for all the young, well, it's sad for the country, but the younger people. So I think we need to have a positive message, but we need to have a real clear out and see where we've been going wrong and restructure in the SNP. Because maybe a lot of people, we were saying about the Commonweal part and all the different aspects of it all, we've got to get people together. And perhaps the SNP as a party have to take a wee step back as not being their lead vehicle to put forward the message of independence. Yeah. It's people on the ground that put it forward. But devolution is not working. Well, it has worked so far, but we can only go so far. We've only got X amount of monies. And what's happening, the Barnett formula or grants, etc., that's already been cut and it'll be cut even more. But the interesting thing is, you've got Labour in charge now in Westminster. So are the Labour Party and Holyrood going to start? They won't start attacking their government. So it's interesting to look at how it's going to pan out in Holyrood.
Pat, it sounds like maybe your mocktail didn't do the trick.
I thought I was quite good.
I'm now passing the alcohol underneath the screen, right underneath your feet.
Okay.
Right, okay. Let's concede. Let's concede that the moment needs hard drink.
But Pat, we've got a minute or so left. I was thinking about your article in the National when Sandra prompted me to that. You had quite a positive, upbeat ending to your article. Yeah. Do you want to maybe say something about that? Or?
Yeah, Indy's not dead. Its profoundest moment is yet to come, given that I think there's a lot of deep currents running under societies at the moment. I mean, funny enough, Brexit, the great story about Brexit is that Cummings changed to take control to take back control. But the idea of taking control of your life faced by a large, implacable global organizations and corporations and trends and technologies, we have a whole different vocabulary for that in the independence movement called self-determination or autonomy or nation state. And I think it's the one big idea of the moment. I think people will react positively if they feel empowered and negatively if they feel disempowered. So I think small I independence, I think, is the key to big I independence. If you want citizens to be strong enough and confident enough to cope with the establishment of a national currency, then, as Leslie Riddick often says, give them experiences of controlling their own lives. And taking responsible citizen-like attitudes towards things that they have power over. Look at a place like Barcelona, which absolutely thrives under those circumstances. We need a bit of an innovation from those kinds of areas. So I think independence, self-determination, self-control, not feeling just at the victim of terrible gigantic forces, but being in charge of the forces that you need to be, I think, is the secret sauce of politics of the next 20, 30 years, particularly as the environmental crisis becomes more extreme. And I think in Scotland, we've actually got a golden opportunity to build that kind of culture, building on what we've done with the Yes movement and the independence discussions of the past. So that's why I'm an optimist.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pat. And I think I could hear you agreeing, Sandra.
I'm an optimist as well. I'm a realist though. I'm an optimist, but Pat mentioned Barcelona. Unfortunately they have been down sort of our way with different parties now, basically, which is, I don't know, but they were real grassroots. They had grassroots of ordinary people in every town, region, etc. It wasn't led by a party. It was led by the people, and that was the amazing thing about it. And they could turn out, well, you saw 1 million people along the street, but these were all individual groups which had an umbrella of pushing forward for independence for Barcelona, getting elections, etc. The Basque Country as well. So yeah, I think we could learn from it, and we should learn from these other countries, and I would really welcome that. And perhaps that's something that's more forward looking than just the Brexit stuff. We were stuck in this wee island, and maybe we should start taking groups of people over to these countries, and just to have a talk and see how they do it. We can all learn from each other.
Cocktail's working, Sheila. Sandra, the cocktail's working.
Kicking in.
It is. It's really nice. Thank you.
Sandra, thank you. Pat, also, thank you to both of you for giving up this sizable chunk of your weekend. But that's it for this week's Full Scottish. But before I go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. You know that our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please do consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, we thank you very much. We're now focused on securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding, and we depend on your support to be able to pay our bills every month. Well, thank you once again to our guests, to Pat, thank you, and to Sandra. Really appreciate it, your contributions. But I'll let you get back to what's left of the weekend and more mocktails, and just say goodbye and thank you for watching. Goodbye.